Yeah, it's recording.
Got it.
Okay, so how
Okay.
are you today?
I am good. How are you? I'm
I'm
trying to
good.
get a better scene for you here. I'm trying to get my flower over here. You don't need to see the messy stuff behind me.
That's okay.
Okay. Now you got the airplane over my shoulder and
Hmm.
my itty bitty red flower over here.
I like the flower.
Thank you. I had a big, well, green poinsettia there, and I thought, well, I like the red better, so I left
Mhm.
that out. All right, let me
Yeah,
just get there. That's a little bit better. Okay. All
so
right.
is it okay if you could tell me your life before you became an author?
Okay, now say that again.
Is it okay if you could tell me about your life before you became an author?
Sure, sure. Okay, I think you had asked, I think when I knew I wanted to write, and I told you I was 5 years old when you know, my mother had read to me, and I was in bed with the measles at age 5. And way back then, they were afraid that if you were in any kind of light, that it would hurt your eyes if you had measles. I mean, remember, this was ancient history to you.
Hmm.
And so I basically was in lying there in the bed, and there wasn't much else to do but listen to the radio. But my aunt was visiting, and she would read to me, and my mother read to me. And when I began to get a little bit better, I started writing. The stories they read to me were uh, Winnie the Pooh and Piglet and all that. And great children's stories. So I wrote my own Winnie the Pooh and Piglet story, and I wrote it on cardboards back then. When men had their shirts done at the laundry, whatever, they'd come back with a cardboard in them. So
Hmm.
I wrote on the cardboard and was trying to illustrate. I'm not much of an artist, but that was my first writing, which you had asked about.
Mm.
But I started reading then, and got totally enthralled with what there was out there to read. And I decided that when I grew up, I was going to write books. So now I do that. But you asked about in the interim. I've always wanted to write, and I wrote throughout uh, high school, college, and I actually worked for newspapers for uh, better than 20 years of my life. That was my career before I became an author. So I worked for several newspapers, so I wrote for them. But the book writing basically started about 30 years ago, but it took me 10 years to get the first book published. So nothing happens fast in the literary world. So it took me a while to get there. But yeah, I've now written 12 books, all about the women who flew in World War II. The original WAFS is my main subject, and also the WASP as a whole is a broader subject. And I'm now working on book number 13.
Wow.
And yeah, that's well, anyway, ask me some other questions. We can go into that later, because
Okay.
that's now.
Mhm. Okay. So, where were you raised?
uh I was born in Tennessee, but my I was born right after Christmas, and the family took me. My mother went home to Tennessee, so I'd be born there. But actually, I grew up in Denver, Colorado, which and I am back in Colorado now after many years. I'm back in Colorado Springs, and I loved Colorado. It was a great place to grow up, and so now I'm home again. So really, Colorado is my major place. I lived a lot of years in Ohio also, but now I'm back here.
Yeah, what was your family like?
Uh okay. Uh I I actually was born before Pearl Harbor, which of course was December 7th, 1941. But
Hmm.
I was too little to really know what was going on. So uh My mom and dad were both, let me back up. You had asked me what did I remember about World War II. Well, really not much until fairly late into it. And part of that was because, again, I was an early reader, and
Hmm.
I began to, I could read headlines in newspapers, and of course then was learning to read in school. So I began to read and know what was going on. So that was my early part in World War II. You asked me about my parent or my family. My
Hmm.
parents were both athletic, and I took after them. My dad taught me how to throw a baseball and how to hit one, and I became a huge baseball fan, and played softball up through college. And also, they both were golfers, and they decided I should learn to play golf. So my dad took me out, started teaching me. Then they gave me golf lessons, so that I, maybe would be a little bit better. Was never a real good golfer, but I dearly loved it. So I've been athletic all my life, as well. So, and I was an only child. Fortunately, I had a bunch of cousins, but I was an only child. So uh, I I grew up, I had to entertain myself basically. And one way I did it was writing. And I listened to the radio, and when television came on, I read everything I could get my hands on, and I watched. Then when TV came along, I got interested in that, but really more in reading.
Um, were any of your family members in the military?
Uh, my uncle, my uncle, who was the oldest in the family, actually was a youngster in World War One. He did not go abroad. He was ready to go when the armistice was signed. His son then was in the Navy in World War II. They were the only two of my relatives who were in the service at that time. Uh, my husband was in the army in the late 50s, after Korea and before Vietnam. And my son, my older son, is now retired from the Air Force after 22 years, and he was a weather officer and made it up to the rank of lieutenant colonel, but he is now retired. So that's the military in my family.
Where did you go to school?
Uh, I went to school, well, in Denver. I went through the public schools in Denver. I went to Vanderbilt University down in Nashville, Tennessee. This was because my dad had gone to Vanderbilt, and he very much wanted his only daughter to repeat that. So I went back to Tennessee for 4 years at Vanderbilt and loved it. It was a marvelous school. And back, well, just like today, back in those days, the state colleges and universities were huge, and Vanderbilt was not that big a school. So I ended up in a school where I didn't get totally lost in this huge. I mean, like Ohio State now has 40,000 or more students, and fortunately, I went to a school that was way smaller than that. And I loved Vanderbilt. It's a marvelous school. It gave me my foundation in writing and in English, which is what I wanted. Oh, I did go back in my older in my older years after I left the newspaper. I went back and got a master's degree. I majored in English in
Wow.
college. I went back and got a master's degree in creative writing back in the 90s, and that's after I left the newspaper, and I wanted to write books. So I figured, okay, I'm going to go back and find out a little bit more about it. And that's one of the best things I ever did, because that launched my career as an author.
That's cool. Um, um, so when during World War II, were there major changes that affected your family during the war?
Not really. My dad had already been transferred to Denver, So we were living in Denver when war was declared, and we lived in Denver until I was actually ready to go to in college. So no, we didn't have to move around, and I was too young to know what was going on really. It was interesting, and you had asked kind of the feelings of what we had back then. Okay, we were in grade school, and we knew there was something called a war on. We really didn't understand all of this. Again, I was age what 6 5 or we didn't have, yeah, we had kindergarten, 5 in kindergarten on up to 8 when the war was over. So we were just aware that there was something called the war going on. When I think back on it, I don't remember. I don't remember any time before that, because by the time I got cognizant of the world, it was on, and it was just something that we knew and lived with. Obviously, we were kids. We didn't know what was going on, but we were aware there was something on, and we had rationing. My mother had rationing stamps that when she'd go to the grocery store, she had to use. So we were all on rations. Shoes were rationed because obviously the army needed them. All those guys out there fighting needed those shoes and boots. So we could only get a certain amount of shoes a year. I don't remember what it was, but we had ration. They were called ration books, and these ration things, stamps. So I do remember that, because I'd go to the grocery store with my mother later in the war, and she'd have to hand over her ration book. So that's one thing that of course went away when the war was over. I was 8 years old when I think you had asked me, yeah, did I celebrate? Yeah. I honestly don't have a great memory of VE Day when the Germans surrendered, because a lot of the hoopla hadn't really started. But VJ Day, when Japan surrendered, that was big, because that meant the war was over. And of course, it was summertime, so I wasn't in school. I was at a friend's house. My mother was playing golf that day, and she had left me with a friend and her mom, and we heard over the radio. So she and a couple of her friends in the neighborhood and I made posters, and we went out. And I think I described all this to you. She lived right along the 6th Avenue streetcar line in Denver, and we got all this ready, and we went out and started beating these. We got her mother's pots and pans, and we're beating on these things, walking up and down the street as the streetcars go by. And these, of course, these are people coming home from work downtown and stuff like that. And we're out there yelling, "The war's over, the war's over." And everyone I've talked to my age since then, that's what happened where they lived. And it was, I can remember some of it. It just was an amazing day. And it was, our lives changed after that. So yeah, that I vividly remember was VJ Day, August 14th, 1945.
Okay, so you told me when and how you got interested in writing. What was your earliest work?
Okay, that that Pooh Bear and Piglet story that I dictated. Of course, I didn't write it. I dictated it. Uh I I I wrote short stories as a kid and in college. I knew I wanted to write books, but I frankly didn't. I didn't have a book in mind. I was young. I hadn't had that kind of experience, and what I really wanted to do was work for a newspaper, because I knew that would mean I would be writing, and I thought that would be interesting. I will never forget when I was graduated from college. My professor, my English professor, said, now, Miss Evans, now that you've graduated from Vanderbilt, what do you plan to do with your degree? And I said, I would like to go to work for a newspaper. He was disappointed because he was thinking, here I had all this literature, and stored up, and that I was going to go out and write books right then. Well, no, I didn't have anything to write about. I'm 21 years old. What do I know? So I went to work for a newspaper very soon after that, and I worked for newspapers for more than 20 years through my my earlier adult life. I got out when I had two kids, and back then we couldn't work, and if we had kids, we couldn't work. They changed that, thank heavens. I remember a fellow reporter of mine saying, "You have to leave because you're pregnant." Yeah, we got that changed. The women's movement did it, but not in time for me. So I went home for a few years, but I did go back to work. I actually worked for the Detroit News, which was a big newspaper, and I had a marvelous job with them. I loved it dearly, and I think I really learned how to write there in college. Yes, but I learned how to write working for the Detroit News. But when the kids were had just gotten in, I have two boys. When they were in school, I went back to work for newspapers and continued to work for them for a number of years. Ended up the editor of two different newspapers. One weekly in Waterville, Ohio, a very small newspaper, and then I edited the twice weekly Centerville Bellbrook Times, living in Centerville, Ohio, which is a suburb of Dayton. And I loved the newspaper work, but I knew if I was going to write books, I couldn't, you can't be a newspaper editor and write books. The time is not there because your time is taken up with the newspaper. And my kids were in college by then. So I left and went back and got my master's so that I could write books. Now I do. But I do love it.
So, is it okay if you could tell me about the WASP and the WAFS?
Yes, it's pronounced WAFS, WAFS.
WAFS, sorry.
And WAFS, yes. Okay, the WAFS came along first. I was fortunate enough well, I'll back up a little. I met my first WASP in 1990, and she is the one who opened that whole field up to me. I'd never heard of them. I was a kid in World War II, but they kept the WASP secret, which was a tragic thing to do. Says I, as an adult now, we didn't know. But I began to learn about what the WASP did from her. And through her, and through a part-time job that I had with a local museum in Dayton, Ohio, Centerville, Ohio, I was doing work for the International Women's Air and Space Museum. That's how I met my first WASP. And I began to follow their story and really learned the story of American women in aviation, starting back right after the Wright brothers flew. The Wright brothers' sister, Catherine, was one of the first women to actually take a flight in an airplane, and she did it with one of her brothers, Orville or Wilbur. I forgot. I think she flew with Orville. And that was like back in 1908. So I began to learn all the history of women in aviation. Other countries, but more so, mostly in the United States, which eventually then led to the WASP, because that was really the beginning for women. Yes, they had been flying throughout the 20s and 30s, but there weren't that many of them. And the WASP showed the world that, yeah, women could fly those airplanes. The men didn't think they could when all this started, and those gals proved it. Okay, I was very fortunate to meet one of the original 28 WAFs, Nancy Batson Cruz, And she is the one who began to tell me the story of how the WAFs were formed. And she asked me specifically to write the story of Nancy Love and the WAFs. Nancy Love is the woman who founded the WAFs. She was put in charge of them by Colonel, later General William Tunner. And together, and this is the thing I want all young girls to hear, so tell your girlfriends.
I will.
Good. He listened. He was desperate for pilots because he had training aircraft being built. The factories were turning them out. We were at war and we needed these things. Mm-hmm. And he didn't have anybody to fly them from the factory to the flight schools. Now, the factories were all up north. The flight schools were all down south. Better weather, particularly Texas. So these planes needed to go to Texas and other southern states, and there was nobody to fly them. He was literally, as he said, beating the bushes for pilots. Well, I won't go into all the story about how Nancy met him, but she met him. Yeah, that's in my books. You better to read the books for that. But when Nancy talked to him, she said, okay, I'll back up. She was a very experienced pilot at that point. She had about 1,200 hours, flight hours, which was a lot. It's a lot today. It's not a lot for the people who fly for a living, but it's a lot. You've learned how to fly. You know what you're doing. So she knew, up to about 100 other women who had that same, who had been flying. And when she met Colonel Tunner, she said, I know of about 100 women who could qualify to fly your trainer aircraft. And he said, find them. I'm hiring you to locate and find them and get them flying for us. And that is what she did. And she built the WAFS, which is Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. And there were 28 original WAFs. There were never any more than 28 WAFs. She built that group in the fall of 1942. And they began ferrying these small trainer aircraft for the Army. And they began getting those planes to the flight training schools down in Texas, where the guys were waiting to learn how to fly. And they started from scratch. The women had to have, the women in the WAFs had to have 500 hours to qualify, which is one heck of a lot of hours. So anyway, they did that. Then as Nancy was getting this group started for Colonel Tunner, and they were literally ferry pilots. They were ferrying aircraft from one place to another. That's what that job is. Another woman flyer, Jacqueline Cochran, had been talking with General Hap Arnold, who was the head of the Army Air Forces in World War II. And she said that she too knew some women who could fly, and she wanted to train more women who could to fly. And he bought into it because he knew how desperate we were at that point for the ferry pilots. Okay, so they start that school is established down in Houston, Texas is where they started. Houston, Texas. And there are 29 girls who entered the first class in November of 1942. So this is like a couple of months after Nancy Love has gotten the WAFs started. Mm-hmm. Totally different jobs here. The WAFs have been hired to actually start ferrying aircraft. The new girls, and what they're called is the Women's Flying Training Detachment. They're not WASP yet, that comes later. So they are the WAFS, the Women's Flying Training Detachment. They are there. They do know how to fly. They had to have 200 hours of flight time, which again is a lot. And most of them got that through what was called the Civilian Pilot Training Program, which was started before the United States got into the war. It was started to train civilian pilots to help build the aviation industry. The minute we were at war, all of a sudden, CPT, civilian pilot training, CPT for short, was used to train mostly men to then go into the Army Air Forces. It was a training school. Well, they've start again. Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of President Roosevelt, very much into promoting women and getting women in where you and I know we can do things, and the guys didn't think so back then. But Eleanor knew, and so she started advocating for women being admitted to this civilian pilot training program. If you're going to teach the men, teach some of the women. So they were allowing one woman for every 10 men. That is where a lot of the women, the girls who went to the Women's Flying Training Detachment came from. They were able to build enough hours there to be admitted to that flight school. So that's who Jackie Cochran started recruiting. And the first class formed in November of 42. They sadly, wrong word, they did not graduate until the end of April of 43. They were supposed to graduate earlier, but the problem was when they got to the flight training school, they didn't have the Army, the primary trainer Army planes there. What the WAFs had been ferrying, they didn't have them at the flight base where the women were. So they had to go back to flying what they already knew how to fly. And they basically wasted a couple of months flying what they already knew how to fly. They had learned how to fly in these non-Army non-Army planes. Finally, when they were able to get Army trainers, which is what the WAFs were ferrying, they began to learn how to fly the Army way in the Army planes. And that was the beginning then of what later became known as the WASP. And let me see, 1,074 women graduated from that flight training school that Cochran and Arnold started in November of 42. And that school went on from then until well, actually till December of 1944. That's how long the women were training there, and that is where they turned out 1,074 actually won their wings at the training school and were graduated to initially to work for the ferrying division. That was the point, to get more ferry pilots. Well, as more of these women came out of the school, the ferrying division had too many women coming in, and they had to cut back. So Cochran began to send her women trainees to other places, other fields, to do other jobs. And that's what happened to most of the women who became WASP. They went on to fly in different areas, and she came up with some good ones. They learned to fly some of the big airplanes, somewhat as an experience, to prove that women could do this. So that is where most of those girls went. In the long run, there were 300, and you probably don't need all these numbers, but 303 women, which included the original WAFs and 275 of the women out of the flight training school. They went into the ferry command and were ferrying aircraft. The rest of the women, after the 303, they are the ones who were sent to the other jobs that Cochrane was finding for them. And that's where the rest of the girls flew. So that's how many and kind of where they went. Some of the other jobs they learned were they towed targets. They slowed what they did called a slow timed engines. After an engine in an airplane was repaired, before they would let the men take it up, they used the women as the guinea pigs to make sure it was okay. So they slow timed these engines to make sure they were all right. That was one of the other jobs. They did many other things, but they're almost well, they're too many to I can't list them all. But anyway, that's who the WASP became. They were filling jobs all over the country at flight bases that released men to go to combat. Women were not allowed in combat back then, and they never. And it's a misnomer that some of the WAFs and WASP ferried aircraft overseas. They did not, and every WASP will tell you, no, we did not. Some of the guys thought they saw women over there flying. If they did, they were not WASP. They flew within the United States and Canada. They did take airplanes up to Canada. And when you think about the US and Canada, that's a pretty daggone big hunk of land. And that they were ferrying through or flying around all those places. I feel like I've talked to death now. There's got to be some specific questions that you'd like to ask.
Was the training difficult for them?
Yes and no. Again, there was a difference in the guys who were sent to flight training did not have to have any training. In other words, they were sent there. They had probably never been in an airplane before. So they were taken from scratch and taught to fly. The women had to have first 200, well, the WAFs had to have 500 hours. The earliest WASP had to have 200 hours. And as there weren't that many women that had those kind of hours. So Cochrane began to break it down from 200 to 100 to 75 to 35. So by the time we got to class 4, WASP class 4, and there were 18 classes total, 18 classes. So class 4, they're the ones that it was down to 35 hours by then. Okay, that's not a lot, but the difference in the women and the men was they had flown and they had gotten their pilot's license with the 35 hours that they learned in CPT. So there is a big difference in how the men and the women were treated, because here's why. The men could, if they were washed out, they could send them to the walking army. The women were not militarized. So if they washed out, they sent them home. That's why they made sure the women had to have some flight experience to even be admitted, which meant that they knew what they were doing. They knew how to fly. Then they had to learn all of the other stuff. And that's when some of the women could qualify and some could not. And that's why some became ferry pilots and others went on to do other things. So that's how the women, and there were a total of 1,102 women who flew for the Army Air Forces in World War II. Did I answer your question? I hope.
How was the service different from when the men served?
Okay. The men were trained to go overseas. I mean, their training was with the idea they were fighting They would be in combat, whether they were flying or driving tanks or in the infantry. They were being trained to go overseas to war. The women were never ever intended to go overseas and did not. So theirs was a job to be done. They worked for the army and they were not militarized. I think you're well aware of the fact that the women were they were expected to be militarized, and Congress turned that down in June of 1944, which is what eventually led to the closing of the WASP. Of course, the war was getting closer to being over as well, but that is why the women were never militarized. But many had been told they would be, so to speak, promised. But they were civil servants during the war, so they did not have, when they were sent home, they didn't have credit for the hours, or basically they were patted on the head and said, "You're really nice girls, thanks for doing this job, go home." And that's what happened. Did I answer you? Okay.
For the WASP, which planes did they have to fly over?
Okay, they didn't fly them. They remember they did not fly overseas, but they
Like,
flew a WASP, or a couple or three, whatever, flew every airplane in the Army Air Force's arsenal in World War II. And the reason I say that is, for instance, 2 WASP were checked out in the B-29, the biggest bomber, the one that bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and basically ended the war. Okay, the reason these women got to fly that airplane is that's I'll think of the guy's name in a minute. This is a name I should know. That bomber was designed to do long range bombing, and basically it was designed for the Pacific theater of war, which meant flying over oceans, over water, not over land. And the plane didn't come along until into 1944. And in the process of building the plane, one of the test pilots ended up being killed in a flight of a B-29 because the engines would catch on fire. There was a glitch somewhere, and the fact that the engines in this big plane caught fire had a lot of the men afraid to fly it. It makes sense, So they were having trouble getting men to say, yeah, they'd fly the B-29. So I'll think of his name in a minute. He met one of the WASP. They were down, I think, down in Florida at one of the bases. And he met one of the WASP, and he saw her get out of a twin engine plane. Okay. And all of a sudden he's going, this is a woman getting out of this fairly good sized twin engine plane. What's going on here? So he stopped her and talked to her, and he learned about the WASP. And he said, okay, what? And she told him what else she was checked out in, and she had been in. She was one of the longer term women pilots. Dora Doherty was her name, and she said, yeah, that she had that some of her friends also could fly these airplanes, and he said, I would like to meet your friend. So he got the 2 of them, and he talked to them. He said, I want you, would you be willing for me to teach you how to fly the B-29? Well, heck yeah. I mean, they were excited. So he taught them. He himself he would go up, and this was a huge airplane. It was a 4-engine airplane. And he would go up with them, and he would one would be in the pilot's seat and one would be in the co-pilot's seat, and he would work with him. Then he'd switch them so they got time in each. He would switch them out so that they were able to get the hang of this. And finally, when they were full-fledged B-29 pilots, he took them out to some of the bases where they were training men to fly them, who were reluctant to go, and he had the women demonstrate that they were flying the airplane. And the guys began to say, well, if a woman can do it, so can I. So his strategy worked. Then the guys in Washington found out he was doing this, and he got a message, and pardon me, I'm going to use the words that he heard: get those damn women out of my airplane. And so he had to. But in the meantime, he'd made his point. These were 2 women. They were 5 feet 4 inches tall, not real big gals. And they were flying this maybe they were 5'5" anyway, but they were flying this airplane, and it shook up enough of the men that they decided, okay, they could try to fly it. If I remember correctly, there were no engine fires after that. Yes, there was combat, but honestly, the B-29, their major function was the ending of the war in the Pacific. And it was the B-29, of course, that dropped the 2 atom bombs on Japan. So, and those were both in August of 1945, and they were the end of the war. But that was the purpose of the B-29, was to be able to deliver this bomb, the secret bomb that they were building down in New Mexico, and that's a whole nother story. But that was, there were other times that other commanding officers used the women pilots to show up the guys, and it was the same old thing. But the B-26, which had a bad reputation for being hard to control, and it would crash. So Jacqueline Cochran put some of her WASP in the B-26, and they learned to fly it. And again, it was kind of the same effect. They were sad. I mean, they were trying to shame the men into doing this. Again, there was a war on, and so that's what they did. And so the gals learned to fly the B-26, and pretty soon the guys, okay, fine, we'll fly it. But they did with several other planes. The P-39 was another one. P-39 was flying casket was the word, and so some of the women learned to fly it, and it was a tactic that was used really throughout the war. But that's the story of the 2 women in the B-29 is really one of the major ones, because that was one big airplane. Did I answer it all? Probably too much.
Yeah. When and how did you get interested in writing about the WASP and the I'm sorry, how do you pronounce this again?
WAFS.
WASP. Thank you.
I know. The broad A. WAFS.
WASP. How did you get interested in writing about the WASP and the WASP?
Okay, the WAFS, Nancy Batson Cruz, I asked her if I could write her biography, and she said no. She wanted me to write about Nancy Love and the WAFs, because Nancy Batson knew the story because she had lived it. She was one of the original WAFs, and those gals, remember, they were the first ones who came into again, they weren't militarized, but they were flying Army airplanes. And she felt, and I totally agree with her, that the WAF's story has been downplayed and somewhat shoved aside because Jacqueline Cochran who had formed the what became the WASP, was a publicity hound, and she took credit for everything that was done, and she had nothing to do with the original WAFs, nothing to do with Nancy Love and the recruiting of those women. They came first, and they came in, all of them qualified with at least 500 hours in order to fly. So their job was totally different from what the most of the WASP were doing. So I told you, women from the first 6 classes, no, I didn't specify that, the girls from the first 6 graduating classes from down in Texas were sent to fly for the WAFs. Not all of them passed. They were brought back to other jobs, but after that, no more were sent to fly for the WAFs, because their training, this is a whole different, longer story. Their training at that point was not sufficient for them to fly what the women in the ferry command needed to fly, because they were by that time moving out of training airplanes into fighters, pursuit aircraft, single engine, single cockpit, totally different airplane. And this happened in the summer of 1943. So where women had been ferrying trainers because they were needed, because the war had moved on, now the major job was to ferry fighters from the factory again. This time, instead of to a flight training field, they ferried them from the factories to the docks. Most of them at Newark, New Jersey, because they were being sent abroad, and those planes were shipped over on Liberty ships. No WASP, no WAFs, no WASP flew the ocean ever. And as I said, that anyone who says they did, that's a mistake, and the WASP will tell you no, they didn't. But that by fall of 1943 was the big push. No longer training planes, but what we needed was pilots to ferry the fighters from the factory to the docks. And the biggest need was the P-51s, which were built in outside of in California, and most of them were going to Newark, New Jersey. That meant ferrying that aircraft all the way across the United States, 2,500 miles. It's a long trip. Of course, it goes pretty fast in a pursuit, which could fly 300 miles an hour. But that became the big job. And that required more ability to fly and more hours to fly. And the girls coming in later just simply did not have the hours, the training, the hours, and the time and grade, basically is what it's called in industry. They didn't have that to qualify to fly these pursuit or fighter aircraft. And that was the big change. Then the change that came after that followed, as you would expect, is the United States began winning the war. And that took a long time. We were losing. We did not know this. The public was not informed. We were losing that war well into 1943. And finally, as things began to get better, as when all of these fighter planes were coming out, the need totally changed. In the long run, it meant they didn't need the women anymore. Now, when I say didn't need them, the military thought they didn't need them. And also by this time, and this is what brings about the end, by this time, the men overseas who have flown their full hours, they are being sent home. Their combat time is done. They're being sent home, and fresher pilots are being sent abroad. This meant the men coming back wanted the WASP jobs. And now comes, this is the sad part of the tale, because the guys wanted the jobs when they came back, and the whole attitude of the war began to change in 1944. We're winning. The men are coming back. They want the WASP jobs, and the press. Oh, also, and they're trying to militarize the women, and a lot of the general populace doesn't think women should be doing this kind of stuff. And that mentality took over. Sadly, most of the newspapers took this on, and they're, 35-hour wonders. That's the girls, taking the place of some man who should have the job. The whole way people looked at the war changed. And basically, this is why the WASP were not militarized, why Congress turned them down in June of 1944, and why then the WASP eventually were disbanded. Everything had changed. We were now winning the war. General Arnold and the others could see where we were going, and they just didn't need the women anymore. So they disbanded them in December of 44 and sent them home. Okay. Yes, they were still needed. And many of the women have pointed that out. Yes, they were still needed. But what we didn't know, and this is what history showed us, is the Germans by that time were beaten. They just hadn't given up yet, but they were beaten. No, the Japanese were not, but we were also winning that war. So now everything is in the United States and the Allies' favor. It's just a matter of time. And of course, a couple of things happened. First, Nazi Germany just finally fell apart. And VE Day came May 8th, 1945. And then when it looked like all the men were going to be sent to Japan to fight that battle, we dropped the 2 atomic bombs in August of 45, and the war was over. So in the long run, the war was over, and everything, of course, changed again. But what happened in the interim is what those girls lived, those women lived. And they had to put up with it, and they had to put up with being sent home, and they had no benefits whatever when that happened. So it was kind of like they were patted on the heads and said, thanks, girls, you did a nice job. Go home, go back to the kitchen, get married, have babies. And that was it. That's the story of the WASP and the WAFS, except that, yes, they remained around, and eventually they got their militarization in 1977 and have finally been recognized. And we're still in the process of getting them recognized for what they did. But those 1,102 women did one heck of a job for the United States of America in World War II, and they helped win the war.
Have you ever heard of a WASP pilot named Gertrude Tommy Tompkins?
Yes.
You have?
She was one of the 38 who died serving in World War II. Yes.
That's how I learned of the WASP. There was a show called Expedition Unknown. The host named Josh Gates said that she was the only WASP pilot who went missing, and her death was never accounted for, I think.
That she is the only one, yes, to this day, who is unaccounted for. That's true. They're still looking for her plane. She took off in a P-51 out of what's now the airport, the big airport out there. And they do not know what happened. There are several scenarios. One is and a woman who knew her. I put some of this story in my book, WASP of the Ferry Command. I tried to tell about the women who died. The women who died ferrying, and I think there were 11 or 12 of the ferry pilots who died, and she's one of them. One of her friends who had done the same thing basically understood this. She said that she thought when she took off that they always said, don't look down. When you take off, you're headed up. And you're supposed to be following your instruments, and you don't need to look down at the ocean because it means nothing. You're already above it, and you're going up. And they think that she may have just looked down and gotten disoriented. And when I say just, it happens that fast. And that she went off the dock and went into the drink. Of course, they have hunted for that plane for years and have not found it. Then the other scenario was that she actually got, as they all did, and I've talked to a lot of them that flew that route. They took off out over the ocean. And they did a 180 and came back and headed east for Newark. And a couple of the men were doing this too, and a couple of guys crashed up in the Sierras as they came back. In other words, they either they got lost or had a problem, whatever, and they crashed in the Sierras. And they found one plane that they thought at one time might have been hers, but it was not. So she's still a mystery. And I think they've solved all of the others. I think she is the only one. And I know I met her niece at one of the Women in Aviation meetings several years ago, and they were still looking for her. Yeah, the very probable story is that she got disoriented after she took off, and I've flown. I have a pilot's license, but I'm not a big time flyer. But I've flown and I've been in the simulators, and I know what they're talking about. I didn't believe either. They say you don't know whether you're upside down or not when you get up and you can't see out. I said, oh, I'm gonna know if I'm, if I'm sitting upright or not. No. You get in the simulator, you find out you do not know. So, and that happened to many men and to some other women as well. And that is to my knowledge, that is still, that's what they think happened. And that plane is somewhere off the Pacific coast, but they're still looking. It's kind of, it's not exactly like Amelia's plane. That's a whole different ball game, but it's, yeah, she's still lost.
In your opinion, what do you think happened to her?
Exactly that. I think she went off the runway and out of the Pacific and went in. Maybe she flew longer than she should have before she made the turn, and maybe that's why they're not finding her plane today, because it's out in deeper water. That's what I think happened. She went in the drink in the Pacific.
How were you able to meet those who served in the two units?
I'm sorry, say again.
How were you able to meet those who served in the WASP and the WAFS?
I met both of them through the International Women's Air and Space Museum, which was originally located in Centerville, Ohio, which is where I lived. And that's where I was the editor of the newspaper. It was a small museum that was built there, not built, excuse me. They occupied an historic house in the downtown part of the town. And because I was interested in women flyers and had been since I read about Amelia Earhart, I went by to say hi and get acquainted. And I absolutely fell in love with the job that they were doing there, because they were working. They had some WASP who were board members, and that's how I met my first WASP, Nadine Nagel. And then Nadine, the WASP, and I, and Joan Rubeck, who was the executive director of the museum, the three of us put together a series of films of the programs that the museum was putting on. We did 3 a year, and for 4 years we videotaped. We had the local cable council videotape these meetings. So there are 12 of these films. After I met Nadine, and I was working with Joan, I was a freelancer working for him, and we decided we wanted to make one of these shows about the WASP. Well, if you do the WASP, you got to also add the WAFs because they were part of the WASP. So I said, well, I just read about this woman, Nancy Batson Cruz. She's down in Alabama, and she was one of the original WAFs. So they said, get in touch with her. So I did, and she came up to Dayton, Ohio, to join in the panel that we'd put together with some WASP that we knew who were local or fairly close. So Nancy flew up from Birmingham, and Nadine and I went out to the airport to meet her, and brought her back. We did our filming, wonderful, wonderful show. And Nancy and I became friends. And she is the one who then I asked to write her biography, and she said no. She wanted me to write about Nancy Love and the WAFs. So she had a reunion in 1999, and she got 5 others. So I had 6 of the original WAFs there in Birmingham, and I met and interviewed them. And that was the beginning of my book, my very first book, The Originals, about the original WAFs. I finally met one more. So I actually met 7 of them. And through that meeting, and with Nancy's encouragement and help, I was able to write that book. As I say, that was my first book. It came out in 2001, The Originals. And it is the book that I tell everyone, if you want to know the story, read it, because it is the beginning. It is the story of the first 28. And then you go on and read, I would love it if you read my others, because it tells some of the other stories, but that was my first book published. And that was about the WAFs, and that is how I met both the WAFs and the WASP through this museum. I still work with them. They have relocated in Cleveland. It's a much bigger museum now, International Women's Air and Space Museum, and I'm one of their advisors. We meet by Zoom, just like this. In fact, Saturday I'm going to be talking to them Saturday morning, same kind of thing. But I'm still, I won't say I'm active with them. I don't live there, but I'm an advisor, and I still do stuff for them.
That's very cool. Have you gone to ceremonies honoring them?
Yes. I've been to several of their reunions. The first one in 1992. And then I went to like 6 straight from 2000 to 2006, and 6. Anyway, yeah, 6 or 8. I think it was 6. And they stopped having them after that. So yeah, I've attended several of their reunions, and I also was in Washington in March 10th, 2010, for when they were given the gold medal, the Congressional Gold Medal for service as civilians in World War II. And of course, they were civilians. Their militarization did not come about until 1979. Yes, I've been to all of those, and I meet up with, or until recently, I would meet up with some at Women in Aviation because they came there. There are only 17 WASP left alive. Most of them are, a lot of them are already 100 or very close. The youngest one, I believe, is 98 or will be 98 in November. And as I say, there are just 17 of them. But
Yeah, I'm hoping that I get to interview them.
Not many of them are interviewable. I think I mentioned that to you, but we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm hoping to.
I know of really only one that I think. Let me see what I can find out. Okay. But as I say, there are only 17 of them. And the one I'm talking about is 101. So we'll see. Okay.
Yep. This is my last question. Do you plan on passing down your legacy to your family?
Yeah, as best I can. One of my grandsons has recorded my story, kind of like you have. And he's thinking about how we might use it. He's 13. He's very into this. His dad is the one who was in the Air Force, and he's really learned a lot about World War II, and has met a couple of the WASP with me. So he's the other three grandkids are aware of it and all, but he's the one who I think is going to carry on the legacy for me. But my two sons are very supportive of my writing the books and all of that, and have been, they've been with me, behind me, with me, all of that. So what I'm trying to do right now, and you can help me. I have my last 5 books, and the 6th one that's coming, the number 13 that's coming. I have aimed at girls your age, young women, 11 to 17, basically, middle school, high school. You are the ones who are benefiting, thank God, from the STEM program, and you are being allowed, I hate to use that word, but the women, these WASP were not included in any science, technology, all classes back then. Only the men took them, and through STEM, now the women, the girls are able to go up through the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics that were really I won't say they were totally denied, because yeah, they could take math, but they were not encouraged, and the higher classes were closed to them. Because of STEM, women, girls your age, young women, now have the opportunity to study what the WASP back then did not have the chance to study. And I'm horrible at math. I could never have done any of this. My mother was a math teacher, but math is my downfall. I'm a creative. I'm on the other side of the line. But I know all these women that I know who did this and who wanted to do it, and had to scrabble their way up. Girls can do this now. And I've written these 6 books about 5 of the WAFs and 1 WASP who did this. And I'm trying to get schools and libraries to actually look at them as, I won't say they're not teaching materials, they're biographies. So what they are, they tell you the story of these various women and what they did and how they did it and what they went through to do it. And they're aimed, as I say, literally, good readers who are 10 or 11 will be fine with them, on up to seniors in high school. And I'm trying to get them noticed. So I have this series of, it will be 6 books. And I do have some that I will donate to a school or a library if they will promise to actually use them. And I've got a stash of them here that have been paid for, bought, so I can do that with them. So your school, talk to your teacher. I would be glad to send her or him. Right now it's only the 5 books because the 6th one's not published, but I would like to see them get in the hands of the young girls. Hey, the guys can read them too. My 13-year-old grandson has read all of them. He loves them. But still they're written for the girls. So
that's amazing.
Now it's a couple of teacher friends of mine who are also writers. They're retired, and they're the ones who told me. They said, stop writing for adults. They know these stories. Write these for the young girls, because they came out of teaching and they knew this. You know, I'm not a teacher, but they're the ones who talked me into it. So I'm trying. There we are.
Yeah. Okay, so that was all my questions.
Right. You're good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was fun.
Yeah, I had fun too.
Okay. Anything else I can do?
Not that I can think of right now.
Okay. I am very appreciative. Tell me again, your school. You told me, I don't.
Its full name is the Winston Preparatory School, but we call it Winston Prep.
Okay. Okay. You had
Yeah,
told me that. I just couldn't remember.
Yeah, it's a private school. It goes up to, I think, I want to say, like, they mentioned it yesterday. I think it's someone said late elementary school to high school.
Yeah,
because now
that makes sense.
I'm in 12th grade.
Right. How old are you?
16.
16. Good. Good age. The
Thank
world
you.
is in front of you. Yes. And your parents should be congratulated. Okay.
Yeah, they're very proud of me.
Anything else? They
no,
should.
I guess that's it.
They should. Yeah. Excellent. All right. If I can answer anything else for you, email me.
Okay.
I'd be glad to. And yeah, you're a good interviewer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.